This is Bigfoot Anonymous.
I contacted one of my friends I've known since we were kids last night. He's a DNR officer here in Michigan. I've been listening to Dogman and Bigfoot encounters the last few months and figured he would be someone that I could ask. He said he's only heard of a few Dogman stories over the past few years. Then I asked, what about Bigfoot? Do people claim to see him? His response was, oh yeah, all the time. He said he personally has never had an encounter, is now a supervisor, so it's rarely in the field. When I was 12 years old with my dad fishing in a John boat, we had a Sasquatch throw stones at us from the side of the bank, approximately 50 feet away, 9 foot tall. Scared us to death. I will never forget it. In fact, Duck River, Hickman County, Tennessee. I had an experience close to the Toba Inlet about 10 years ago. I was boating with my folks and cousin, and we just had anchored in beautiful and extremely remote little cove on East Redonda Island. There are no roads or houses anywhere on this island. It is a few hours boat ride to the nearest human settlement. The shore was very close to the boat, maybe 30 yards away due to a sudden drop-off of deep water. And we were all sitting at the rear of the boat enjoying some beverages when all of a sudden the forest went quiet, and we all got this strange feeling that something was off. Suddenly, a gigantic log that weighed probably in excess of 200 pounds was thrown out of the deep forest towards our boat. It landed in the water with an almighty splash about 15 yards from the boat. I emphasize that it was thrown. It came out of the forest horizontally and on a dead calm evening. We then heard odd noises from the forest, after which my dad went and got his old Winchester 30-30 from down below. We all were pretty freaked out at this point. We ended up taking off the next day and have avoided that particular bay ever since. 100% believe in the stories. Something is out there, and it is something people should be aware of. I was in Orleans, California, along the Klamath River at like a KOA type campground where they have hot showers, and met a couple who were camping at a remote campsite called Elk Valley. It's 25 miles up this logging road called AC Road. It's about 15 miles past the Patterson-Gimlin film site on Bluff Creek. They were camping up there. In the middle of the night, one come into their camp area screaming and beating on the side of a tree next to their camp. Was so scared that they jumped in their car and left all their camping equipment there, and they weren't going back to get it. I told them to wait there at KOA and I would go retrieve it for them. When I got up there, I found the campsite and all their equipment was still there, and right on the edge of the campsite there was a tree that had all the bark beat off it, 2 foot square area, all the way down to the bare wood about 8 feet up the side of the tree. This was one of the many accounts I've heard of people being scared out of this spot in the middle of the night. I had 2 first-hand encounters during the fall of 1978. I will never forget what I and my siblings saw that day. Estrero, Florida area. Leave them alone. They are never alone. I say this because the one I and my brother saw was different from the one I saw a few weeks earlier. I was alone that day, and the fear I felt was beyond measure. There are things we can never forget, no matter how much we try. Me and my son have been, every extra minute been in the woods since I was 9, and when he came along the same, I have seen 2 have had this crap scared out of me, by one fishing one time and his friends by one a huge sandbar one time after cornering against a river with a full bank of KC lights until it had enough and came for the extra they were in, and they barely got away. My first encounter was in 1976 in Georgia. My dad and I were sitting in a tree stand on an afternoon hunt. I was 10 years old at the time, and I would just go along and watch since I was too young to shoot. That afternoon, we heard heavy footsteps in the draw below us. My dad raised his gun and pointed in that direction of the sound. Whatever it was pushed a tree over. My dad was shaking like a leaf, and he wasn't scared of anything. He told me it must have been a bear or something. After whatever it was left, we climbed down and left in a hurry, well before dark. That was something he never did. I didn't realize until years later, when researching Bigfoot, that the county we were hunting in had reported multiple Bigfoot sightings in the same area we were in. My dad never spoke about the incident ever again, even when I asked him about it point blank. It changed him. But we continued hunting together for the next 40 years. He passed away 2 weeks ago on July 25th. I wish he would have told me the truth back then. I have had 2 more encounters with them, but never a sighting. But I know they are in certain areas. Rest in peace, Dad. I'm going to miss you this season.
I was feeding these things for a while, placing food up in trees 8 to 10 feet up with one trail cam. Long story short, food gone, no pictures. So I went to 3 cameras around this tree, all cameras covering the tree, and the other camera's food still disappearing. I came to the conclusion that these things are so fast that it's scary. By the way, I duct taped the food to the tree and slow them down didn't work. Look at my picture on the left. There's 3 reddish brown ones in there.
Stopped a female ranger in Colorado on the west side of Pikes Peak 3 years ago. I was new there and asked her if she ever ran into Sasquatch. She said she's been there 11 years and kinda knew where they were. She said Fox News local went there 3 nights and got scared and left. As a note, this is the Crags. I covered more ground than a billy goat. Place was devoid of elk, moose, and deer. It was strange as it looks, elky and deery. I could tell you that my mate's uncle was out in the bush by himself around a fire, late at night. He said a 10-footer walked up towards him that he could only make out the silhouette of this creature. He grabbed his axe and raised it onto his shoulder and told it to F off. These people are indigenous, and it's part of their culture. He had no reason to lie, but just imagine being out there by yourself. I believe 100% they exist, and it's just not First Nations people who are aware that they are out there. Many sightings have occurred, some close to residential properties.
A friend worked for the U.S. Forest Service. They weren't supposed to be armed, but he always had a .44 in his saddlebags in case a horse broke a leg or something. Something tried to get in his cabin he was in. He said he didn't care if they fired him or not. He got that gun out. The .44 seemed awfully small right then. He figured it was a bear, but I don't think he ever saw it. In the late 2000s, I worked north of Fort Nelson, British Columbia, with a seismic outfit. We were extremely isolated and had to be flown in. One of our guys was scared silly by something in the woods that was throwing large stones and made guttural noises. He was a solid guy. I became a believer after his story. And all the things that I've experienced that nearly lost my life. I have to say the one most regrettable moment that nearly lost my life was when I had one that was at least 14 feet tall in front of me. I was expecting to be able to look back and see somebody with me, and when I noticed, he was about 60 to 80 yards heading back the way we came from, and I was hotter than a $3 pistol. When I turned around, I must have still had that look when I was looking at that guy wanting to shoot him for leaving me behind with this thing. When I turned back to look at front and Minnie stood up and my whole being withered away in hopes that this guy did not step on me or worse, part me. Boy, was I lucky he was okay with looking at each other before he split the forest like as if it was just weeds. It never slowed him down. He even shook the ground just before he got to the trees as he took off. It was nuts, to say the least.
I have experienced just 2 years ago the house slap. Typically one slap, but it happened from 4 different nights. Twice I ran out with the gun in hand and nothing was there. Then another night I heard the roar, aka scream. It did it 3 times at midnight, one night only. Although I heard heavy wood knocks about 30 different nights. This is in Georgetown County, South Carolina. I don't know why people go back into the woods and hunt, even later in life. It has to be tough. By the way, my friend saw one when she was 9. They're still on her property in South Upson County, Georgia. Her family has all kinds of problems with them for 45 years now. To this very day, they are real. When I was goat raising, I would have to put down a sick, dead, or badly injured goat. The goat was there for a few days before gone with no remains, not even any hair or drag marks. The ones I shot on location, the body gone the same way, but the blood-soaked soil was eaten down to about 6 inches. The guts, head, skin, and feet of harvested goats and chickens, turkeys, were always gone the next day, nothing left behind. I always thought it was mostly the coyotes that fed on it. I have never seen crows, ravens, vultures pick a carcass clean to the bones and fur. Then coyotes grabbed the bones, but fur was always left behind or dragged off. Maybe all these years I was feeding a family of Bigfoots. My wife and I used to live in Whistler and would do a lot of hiking in the summer. We often felt like we were being watched in remote places, particularly at the end of the old abandoned Parkhurst Mill on Green Lake. Groveland, New York, 2006. My age then, 16. My brother, 14. We had a fort area far back in the woods behind our house where we used to play fight and stuff with sticks and poles almost every day. One day I stayed in the house while my brother and his friend went back up there to play in the afternoon. They weren't gone long before they came back terrified and rambling about how something creepy happening in the woods. They both described 2 phenomena. An unknown very large bird flew over and screeched unlike any bird they've ever heard before, and the forest became dead silent. They claimed to hear something stalking them from across the creek and up the hill, at which point hauled it through the woods and up the road back home. Fast forward to the next day, I agreed to go back with Mom's shotgun just in case it was a rabid coyote, as bears are extremely uncommon in that area but not unheard of. When we got to our spot, I leaned the shotgun against a tree at the fort and we carried on playing and making noises as usual. At about the time they claimed to experience those phenomena, about 5:30 give or take, our play was cut short by a very blood-curdling screech from a large bird. I could barely make it out over the canopy and see its shadow on the floor. Once I gathered my senses, my brother either monitored or listened and said, "Listen." At which point I noticed that the forest was dead silent. I slowly walked over to where my shotgun was and picked it up. I could hear very subtle footsteps up the hill and across the creek that sounded like a person trying to sneak around, because it stopped when I fixed my eyes on where I thought I heard it. I thought, I'll just fire off a shot and scare this coyote away. I raised the muzzle, and before I could flip the safety off, there was a terrifying sound of gigantic bipedal footsteps. I running either way towards us. I don't have to tell you. I ran. My brother ran as Fred ran. I could tell the footsteps stopped because I was so scared and running so fast I almost dropped my gun. The entire walk home I felt like I was being watched. Now these footsteps were loud. I've heard bear, deer, mountain lion running before. They were really quiet compared to what I heard. And it was distinctly bipedal. It wasn't until I started Googling for similar stories that I realized that it could only be one thing. By the way, I have never been able to replicate the sound. It sounded like a damn T-Rex running. I'm curious if anyone else has heard Sasquatch running if it's loud. It's been 20 years and I still get goosebumps when I tell it. I brought the possibility of Bigfoot to my bro, but he's super skeptic and tries to explain it away with anything he can. Problem is, nothing he suggests makes any sense at all, especially since we can't replicate the sound.
I was squirrel hunting in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia in 2010. It was early morning around 9 a.m. I was about 100 yards from the Shenandoah River, sitting tired, and it was overcast. It was fall, leaves everywhere, and also huge rocks in the woods. I was also hidden very well.
My mind was more on getting a hot breakfast than squirrels, but I remained quiet because it was relaxing. I remember thinking to myself that if I had chosen a good spot, the squirrels were somewhat active, but too far for me to shoot. I had also seen a few deer. All of a sudden, I didn't hear anything. The squirrels were gone, no deer. At this point, I remember smelling something that kind of smelled like a rotting cow in the field. All my senses were 100%. My heartbeat seemed loud. I thought maybe a black bear was coming to the river with a kill. All I had was a 410 shotgun for squirrel hunting, not ideal for killing a bear if I had to. Again, I was sitting kinda in between some big boulders, trees, and leaves, and then it happened. From about 50 yards, something threw, pushed, or rolled a tree. That tree was about 10 feet long, but thick. I'm thinking, oh shit, this pissed off black bear with a cub or Bigfoot. My eyes were glued. I was frozen in a seated position. Yeah, there was a pissed off Bigfoot about 40 yards from me. He saw me, maybe 7 foot tall, more reddish than anything. Shoulders bigger than Arnold's ever were. He walked off. He did not run. I stayed there for about 15 more minutes because I was scared. It was not a bear. It was not Oprah. It was big. In an abandoned building, a huge abandoned building, we heard a massive crash in the next section of the building. We decided it must have been a ceiling fan or something, but when we walked past the floor, we saw absolutely nothing. We searched the whole place, even the effing roof, and we still never found a trace of what could have possibly made that sound. Went back another time and it seemed to encounter other people. Not really sure, but we heard screams like the sound of someone being murdered. The shit was so scary we ran back to the car and we stayed there for hours and never even seen a damn soul leave the building. We waited nearly 6 hours too. Went back another time a year later, heard the sounds of footsteps on the broken glass at the end of the hall behind us, never seen who it was. Each time we went there, something effed up happened. I'm done going there, that's for sure. It's been 2 years now. I drove past and apparently someone is feeding large amounts of stray cats that seem to be taking shelters there. All the doors wide open, windows broken, fences and gates ripped open. Lots of evidence of foot traffic going in, and I'm not getting any closer to wanting to go inside there again. That's for sure. I've lived in a wooded area of North Houston all of my life. I was born in '63 and do have relatives and friends who have had Sasquatch experiences. Between 71 and 80, they have had 3 experiences altogether. One was my brother. He says he saw one bending over and to peek into the house through the back patio we had. He about knocked the door off of the room us and my grandfather were in. She was lacking myself and other older brother at the time, and she would do it in a private way so that the entire family didn't get involved. My brother was only about 6 or so at the time, and he was scared so bad that he about came through that door. We grew up in the woods and for the most part seemed not afraid of the dark. Another time, 4 or 5 years later, a feeding of ours used to walk through the back pasture, and he would do so at night. It did not that night because he came back from the backyard as white as a cotton sheet, claiming he saw one at the barn. It was on blocks and it was about 9 or 10 foot at the roof, and he says that the thing was shoulder height at the roof. He says it was taller than the barn roof. Another time, another brother and friend of mine rode trail bikes out to deer camp a mile or so into the woods and claimed they'd seen the corner Saint Camp. That one ran out of the camp and ran behind it and stood and covered the back window, which was about 6 or 7 foot at the bottom of the window, because the camp was a wooden shack on blocks. So yeah, I do believe there is such thing as these people describe. And as youngsters with our friends, we were not scared of much except Dad catching up on us up to no good. I live near Humpback Road. Several sightings in that area. Some people don't want their sightings to be made public, so I'll repeat the stories of those who don't care. Some people live near the hydro lines on Humpback, next to the non-catchment lands of the watershed, say they've seen them. Those people have since moved. New people are not believers. Across from Humpback Road, as it meets Souk Road as Woodruff Road, The off-duty RCMP saw 4 walking up a barricaded old dirt road in the daylight. 2 adults, 2 young ones. She was less than 30 feet from them. Residents on Woodruff Road also saw footprints in the mud near their fenced-off apple orchard and heard big screams and howls one night from some unknown creature. They said whatever it was big. They did contact John Biedernagel about what they heard. I doubt they are frequently in those areas anymore, as they clear-cut logged most of the east side of Humpback for a subdivision, clear-cut most of the east side of Woodruff for our industrial park and housing. Plus there's a lot more humans hiking in the area now. Lots of trails lead deep into the woods and some connect to the Shawnigan Lake and Sook. First Nations told me Sasquatch used the hydro lines to travel from Sook to Humpback. They crossed Sook Road and then traveled the mountain ridges and valleys back to Sook. I rode my horse in these woods that back on the Humpback Road almost every day for years and never saw anything, and a hiker put trail cameras in the woods for years, never caught one on camera. I worked with a young man, super nice guy, honest and straight as a gun barrel. We worked together at a couple of jobs and became good friends. He stopped by my house one day and we were talking about things, and he loves to hunt, so we got around to talking about that. He's lived and hunted all over the U.S., including Alaska. During our talk, I asked if he ever had strange things happen to him while out hunting. He gets very nervous and begins to fidget in his chair. He then tells me about an encounter he had with a thing. He never used Bigfoot, the words Bigfoot or Sasquatch. He ran across this thing a couple of times on the same property, and on one of them, he had someone else with him and they saw it too. We worked together for years and he never talked about the subject at all, and he only confided in me when I really didn't experience that I had. I'm an avid hunter in central PA, and even though it's not vast expanses of forest, there are plenty of out-of-the-way places for a large creature to thrive. This brings me to a very weird experience I had a few years back, and all the years I spent outdoors, this is the only time it ever happened, and I think about it all the time. It was mid-October, I was in archery hunting, and the weather was typical for season. All morning and early afternoon, I was seeing all kinds of wildlife like you normally expect. I was in my stand and happened to notice all forms of life just vanished, not even a bird chirping. As I sat there, a strong sensation of being watched came over me. In fact, it was bone-chilling. After 20 minutes or so, the feeling of being watched eased up and the wildlife reappeared. At one point, I thought I smelled a slight pungent smell of some wet fur almost, but I never seen anything or heard anything. I was 40-ish at the time and never gave in to flights of fancy, but that was the last time I hunted in that area. When I was a youngster, my cousin and I would go hunting out west. This is Australia out west. On one particular trip, we found a cave, and inside the cave was a full skeleton of a particularly huge person, being, or something. We were both a bit scared. Actually, our brains were saying, legs, do your duty now. I'm 62, so when I measured the forearm bone, it was about 2 or 3 inches past the fingers of my forearm. My cousin held the bone against my elbow and measured it that way, left the bones intact, and took off. No photos, as this was 53 years ago. There has always been stories of Sasquatch beings over here, but no positive encounters. As you say, it's easier for F-wits to deny they live rather than open their mind. Keep the stories coming, either will do. They're awesome either way. I was asleep in our cabin in the mountains of northeast Huntsville, Utah, with 4 of our hunting friends. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw what looked like a giant floodlight above the cabin, lighting up the cabin for 360 degrees. It scared the crap out of me, and I didn't dare look out the windows or open the doors. Felt like a UFO was above the cabin. When I asked my friends in the morning if they saw anything, they said they were asleep. I'm from Boise, Idaho. They're here, the Yeti. I've seen huge orbs lighting up a part of a small mountain where I camped. They're like a flashlight and travel the tops of mountains. Come down to a camp we've created further down this ravine. It lights up an area about 20 in diameter. An invisible being was like searching around that area. Then as I watched, it light up around the creek and the other side of the creek about 20 yards. The light was traveled halfway down the path towards us. No sounds, just light. It stopped. Everybody except me was asleep. It scared me. It stopped and had to have seen us. It disappeared about 40 yards up our path. Something unforgettable. So if you ever come out to Idaho, we have weird things here too. I heard something one time at a remote lake about 28 years ago. I was there fishing around 5 p.m. and right before dark I heard this big guttural growl. Well, needless to say, I grabbed my stuff and walked backwards all the way back to my truck and got the F out of there. I had never been back. Someone could offer me millions of dollars and I would tell them where to stick that million. It wasn't a bear, because we don't have bears in southeast Indiana. But I do believe in Sasquatch, and I've seen many UFOs. Found a set of Bigfoot tracks when I was younger in Johnston, PA. There was actually a big set and a small set that went through a swamp in the back of a dam. No cell phones back then, so no pics, but the tracks were a lot skinnier than the tracks you see on TV, but long, way too skinny and long to be people tracks. Around the same time we would be fishing and hear rocks and logs smacking shit way off in the distance, like big logs thumping trees in a pattern. I had an encounter with a juvenile hiding in a bush. He was around 2.5 feet tall, but was very wide and heavy, and I actually was tired from trekking when I decided to rest for 20 minutes and walked off the path, and I hear growling coming from my left, and I got up and looked inside the bush, and there was a small monkey-looking boy started screaming loud, and I tried to touch him, but he was flinching. He crawled behind the bush, and I followed him and told him to stop, but he kept screaming, and I was trying to pick him up, but he was too heavy, and I stayed with him all the way until I actually got lost in the forest because I was looking down at him for a while. He just kept screaming, and I thought he would bring in other predators, which exactly happened. I heard a noise, loud scream that came from ahead, and looked up, and his nose was getting dark and the light was dappled. I knew I was in shit, and I froze in my tracks while the baby moved ahead because there was a tall man or woman that came through 2 trees. He was covered in complete hair and looked mad as F, but didn't come forward, and I heard another scream from my right, and I didn't see anything. I looked back at the tall, heavy person. He had the kid between his legs, and I said, "Sorry, please let me go," because the fear I had was a lot, and I thought he would kill me, and I turned around and walked back, and when I reached out of view, I ran and ran until I met 2 hikers who I told what happened, and I tagged along with them until I backed out. Had one come visit me at my campfire while I was cooking. It was a juvenile, just stood there in the bushes peeking at me. Didn't feel threatened by it. It ran off once I yelled and made noise. I am certain that my sister and I had an encounter with what I believe was a juvenile. Whatever it was ran across the county road in front of us on all fours, and it was fast, literally a flash, but we both saw it. Nothing I've ever seen was as fast, and yes, it had a Hemi. But it was the best night ever, for we were on our way to go pick up where soon became the love of my life, an English bulldog. He's my soul partner and my density best friend. So yeah, when I think Sasquatch, I always think bulldog puppies, so they're not that bad. I saw a juvenile Bigfoot jump out of a tree 50 feet away at 5 p.m., full daytime sighting. It was 20 feet on a big branch. Watch me burn brush on a steep hillside that is hundreds of feet down into a medium river. It must have been there for a while. I never paid attention. I let my blue heeler outside and she was watching me, then the tree, me, then back to the tree, back and forth to see if I was making eye contact with it. I looked where she was looking, and immediately that thing knew it was busted and made the decision to leap. I got a good look at it too. It landed like a superhero on its feet in one fist, then hopped on all fours, running diagonally away from me. My dog took off after it, and I was screaming no to her. The smaller one was the size of a large black bear, but had a long, wavy, clean, and shiny brown and grayish hair bouncing every time it touched the ground. which wasn't much considering it was gracefully hauling ass and was lightning fast. And yes, it looked like a headless bear animal when running, but way faster and smoother than a bear could run. It ran to a ravine and then it just disappeared. No sound, no visual after I ran to my dog. She didn't chase it into the ravine where it gets thick and very steep. This is one of the many sightings I've had. My daughter's seen them too. My son-in-law's seen them. They come to the property at night and look in the windows and even knock on them. My friend's seen a Sasquatch in Kalamazoo, Michigan, right on the edge of downtown on the south side next to the river in an abandoned jelly factory, and it whistled really deeply at his dog with a smile and never looked at him, just stared at the dog. And he said every hair stood up on his body and ran his ass back home. He told me the thing was in the doorway to the building facing the road, about 20 feet from him, with his head being taller than the security fence next to the building.
Master the art of music. Learn guitar and bass. Drums. Singing and screaming. I will teach you how to handcraft your music your way. Visit oneboundmusic.com. ONEBOUND music.com.
Hey, I'm Connor from Bigfoot Anon, and I'm always on the hunt for the next big adventure. When you're on the trail for long hours, you build up quite the stench, enough to drive any skunk ape or yeti away. Luckily, I'm on the quest now for the solution to all my problems. Yeti bars. They do exist. Available in tons of different scents and fragrances. Check out YetiBars.net for more and use my code BA10 for a special offer. Clean like a beast. Yeti Bars!
The flesh of the unguided and non-believers fuel this void.